I think probably like the best piece of advice we could even give on this episode is the idea of making your own samples when you record your tracks.
This is the Self-Recording Band Podcast, the show where we help you make exciting records on your own, wherever you are, DIY style. Let's go. Hello and welcome to the Self-Recording Band Podcast. I am your host, Benedictine, and I'm here with my amazing co-host, Malcolm Owen-Flood. How are you, Malcolm?
Good. I'm excited to be here. I've been sitting inside, self-quarantined, and I really like chatting with people.
Yeah, same here. Like everybody does right now. That's why the internet is just fast enough to do a podcast, I think. I hope it will be stable and get us through till the end.
Yeah, people might have to bear with us while we go through this, just because we're not always going to be able to record in our usual setup. But I think it's going to work out great.
Yeah, I think so too. And in case you're wondering if this is sounding a little different than usual, I'm using a different mic today. I'm using a handheld mic, as I'm not in my studio, but in my home office, because we are, I can still work, but because of the whole Corona stuff, we cannot really leave the house and should only do if absolutely necessary. So I tried a little home podcast setup today, and I hope that works. But yeah, if you're listening to this in like a year or so, you might not know what we're talking about, but that's the case right now. So, by the way, if you've just discovered this podcast and you don't know what we're all about, and you like this is the first thing you listen to from us, there's a platform called the Self-Recording Band. It's the same name as this podcast, and it's about teaching people how to record on their own in their jam spaces, how to make exciting records on their own without actually making them sound like a demo or a DIY record. And if you go to the selfrecordingband.com, that's the website, you'll find a blog, you'll find all the podcast episodes, you'll find videos, you'll find free downloads. And right at the homepage, or if you go directly to the selfrecordingband.com/10-step guide, you'll find a 10-step guide to successful DIY recording. It's a free PDF that like kind of walks you through step by step through the whole process of making a record on your own. And it's a great starting point. It like gives you an overview of the whole process. It gives you actionable things that you can implement right now. And yeah, go to the selfrecordingband.com, download that thing, and let me know what you think about it. Today's episode is the third one of a little mini-series that we did. And this series is on drum samples, MIDI drums, drum programming, stuff like that. And we've already talked about situations where programming might be better than using real drums. We've talked about situations where the opposite is the case. We talked about actual MIDI programming, how to do that and how to make that sound natural. And today, in the third and last episode of this mini-series, we're going to talk about why and when your drums might benefit from sample enhancement or sample replacement, and why drum samples or your drums mixed with drum samples might actually sound more natural than just your real drums. Malcolm, have you ever experienced that using samples actually helps the real drums, like without making them sound artificial or less organic?
Yes, this is. I'm really glad we're talking about this, because this is not a popular opinion, I don't think, anyways. And it's something that I definitely agree with. I think that drum samples can sound a lot more natural than some of the live drums I've been sent. And I don't know, we might get like, I don't know, we might get attacked for saying this kind of stuff. But I think until you've had to fix some kind of terrible sounding drum recordings, you might not understand. So the immediate thing that comes to mind is like a clipped snare drum, like a badly clipped snare drum. I've had that happen a few times, and like it's across the whole track. So how else are you going to fix that other than continuing to clip it or using a transient designer to like take this harsh clip off of it? anything you do is just going to like mangle the drum sound even more. Whereas if you can find a snare sample that sounds along the lines of what your natural snare drum was meant to sound like, you might be able to completely swap that out without anybody ever being the wiser. And instead of them getting hit by this annoying clipped snare drum sound, and when I'm saying clipped, I'm not meaning like the warm, good sounding clipped. I'm meaning like the like weird, artificial sounding clip. Instead of distracting the listener with this weird noise every time the snares hit, they're going to hear what to them sounds just like a natural snare drum that's meant to be there. I think that's what you're kind of talking about, right? Stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought of it in 3 different ways, mainly when I was preparing that episode. The first thing that came to mind was the situation where a drummer, and that's a pretty common situation, where a drummer might just play a little inconsistent, like some hits are very loud, some are very quiet, but you actually want like a constant punch that stays the same throughout the song. And if you want to do that without using samples, you probably have to compress and automate the drums a lot in mixing. That basically brings up all the unwanted stuff as well, all the bleed, all the cymbals and the snare mic. Maybe if there's a ring or something that's not too pretty sounding on the snare drum that you didn't like really hear when you were playing or recording the drums, that all like gets louder and more obvious. And also, if you want to make a drummer sound like he or she hit really hard, you probably have to EQ in a little bit of the attack, the stick attack and stuff like that, which will also bring up like nasty stuff. And correcting the performance that will be necessary to achieve that result will sound pretty weird, or can sound pretty weird in the end. Whereas using a sample to like a constant sample to like even out the performance a bit, and if you choose a sample that's like close to the real snare or whatever drum you're enhancing, then that can preserve the tone, that can keep the bleed down, that can keep all the nasty stuff down low, but still give you the punch and the stuff that's lacking without having to completely like mangle the original signal, right? So
yeah, absolutely. I think that's got to be my main reason and main use of samples across the board, is just trying to make inconsistent playing more consistent, and that can be like in the case of a snare drum, hitting off center, so this like actual sound of the drum changes depending on where you hit it, right? So if the drummer can't like hit dead center every hit, the sample can solve that. But also dynamics, just also if it's too quiet of a hit versus too loud of a hit, and it's just not natural, the dynamics are shifting too much. Again, samples can come in and just solve that issue for me really easily and transparently.
Absolutely. The second thing that I'm thinking about is sometimes you have to get rid of a lot of ugly like resonances, frequencies, stuff like that. So even if the performance is great, if the kit is just like not balanced really well, or like not tuned really well, if there's like cymbals that are not ideal and some of the bleed is in the close mics or stuff like that, you have to do a lot of tiny or drastic EQ moves with like very narrow EQ bands and like notch all that nasty stuff out, and like really you have to do a lot of drastic like things and add a lot of filters and stuff to the sound. And if you use a sample that has the same characteristic basically as the real thing, you might get away with less drastic EQ moves, and you just keep the real drum a little lower and add the sample in, so you need less EQ. So even if with a consistent performance, but a drum kit that's just not sounding very great, or that has like weird resonances and stuff, it can also help, I think. So yeah, that's basically number 2. And then the third on my list is sometimes people refer to, sometimes people perceive raw and organic and natural and stuff like that as, or the other way around, they perceive records as raw, organic, and natural and like energetic and stuff if they are processed pretty heavily sometimes. That sounds counterintuitive, but sometimes records that have a lot of saturation and distortion and stuff like that, like the character effects, the like plugins and hardware units with like tone and character, if they get used heavily, and if like everything is like really like processed aggressively and like saturated and stuff like that, that's what people often refer to as raw and organic and energetic and not super clean, but like this dirty kind of aesthetic. And you can only really do that to a drum kit that's sounding balanced and that's sounding great in and of itself. Because if you do that, if you apply such a sound, such a vibe to a drum kit that's not really sounding great, or to an inconsistent performance, again, all the nasty stuff will come up and it just won't sound great. So you need a great like material to start with to actually like butcher it and like crush it and like make it really dirty and aggressive. And sometimes the use of samples and sample enhancement allows me to use even more compression and saturation and character effects than
it gives
just
you
the
more
usual thing.
flexibility. Yeah, sorry to cut you off there. I got excited.
Yeah, right.
But you're absolutely right. Like essentially, the less bleed, the more control you have to accomplish what you hear in your head. Because bleed is where compromise gets introduced into the equation of drum mixing and drum recording. Because you might want more top end on your snare sound, but that is going to mean more hi-hat in your snare mic. If there's a hi-hat in your snare mic. Now with the sample, there will be no hi-hat. So you can accomplish this distorted, fizzy top end snare sound if you wanted that, without also turning up your hi-hat. And you now have control. A question for you, Benny. Do you gate your drums?
When I record them, definitely not. Sometimes some people do that.
Yeah, I know, they're madmen.
Yeah, exactly. But in mixing, sometimes, but rarely. Like I prefer, like what I do most of the time is cutting out, like cleaning up tom tracks, cutting out tom hits by hand. That's a thing I do. I rarely gate the snare. What I sometimes do is I do a parallel snare track or kick track and gate it really aggressively and very short, basically just the attack is left. And then I compress that heavily and EQ it heavily and like mix it with the original to get more attack if I want that. I sometimes do that, but the actual tracks, not so much. No, not really. I don't know. I kind of don't like the way most gates work and sound, I guess. I mean, you can do it with MIDI gates, stuff like that, but still, I don't know. It's just me. I don't use gates.
That's cool. I find myself doing it recently, but the reason I wanted to bring it up is because that's one way that people might think, oh, okay, well, I can avoid bleed issues by gating my drums, and then I can still compress and just do whatever I want to my snare or whatever drum you're doing this to. But
I see where you're going here.
You'll find that even doing that, although this will improve that situation if bleed is really the issue for you, but by doing that, you're still going to end up with bleed existing when the gate is not there. So samples can still do a better job at this kind of really tight effect than a gate can.
Oh yeah, and that's actually a super good example, because that can sound really weird and artificial compared to the natural sample sound. Because probably one of the most annoying things in drum sounds is this psh, psh kind of tone whenever like the gate opens when you hit a snare, and then the bleed comes through for like a half a second or something. That's so annoying and super distracting and absolutely artificial sounding. And you don't have that if you use samples instead of gating. Yeah. You're so right.
Earlier mixing Malcolm is definitely guilty of that. The hi-hat splash doubling in volume when the snare hits. It was brutal. Don't be early Malcolm.
Yeah, exactly. Also, that's a pretty common thing. And I sometimes have to use samples because otherwise it's just not possible. With tom fills, when a crash is like following the tom fill, sometimes there's a quick fill, a quick thing over the toms, and then a crash right after that. And if you want to preserve the sustain of the last tom of that fill, there will be, and if the cymbal is, especially if the cymbal is close to the floor tom or whatever the last tom is, then there will always be this weird cymbal hit that will come through for a tiny moment. and you can only like get rid of that if you use a sample or if you change the fill like in the first place. But if it's already recorded, you can basically only use a sample or do some filter automation or stuff like that. But that's also a pretty common thing for me that I hear a lot of times. Also in other mixes, I sometimes hear that.
Right. Yeah. And it's not to say that I haven't heard some effects, like going back to that hi-hat getting a little louder. If that's the groove of the song, is like a hi-hat accent on the snare, you can actually enhance it with it. But generally, stuff like that should be avoided, especially if that's not the intent of the drummer, to have these weird accents being the result of your gating and processing.
Sure. What do you think should people do, or can people do, to be able to keep as much of their natural performance when they record? And what can we do so that people can rest assured that what they get back after mixing will still sound natural? Like, because that's what many people are afraid of. They want to keep as much of their original drum sound because they're afraid that the final mix will sound nothing like their drum recording. So I think we should tell people, or should give people advice on how to actually improve their drum recordings, and then also what we can do to ensure that it stays natural.
Right. Yeah, there's the two big and maybe obvious, but I don't think they can be said enough, points that come to mind is playing consistently and hitting consistently, both in the dynamics and in where you hit the drum for tone and note to be consistent, right? Like I mentioned earlier, if you hit a snare off center, it sounds pretty drastically differently than if you hit it dead center, or maybe all the hits are meant to be rim shots, so that stuff definitely has to be locked down. Floor toms are another big one. The bigger the drum, I find, the more important it is that the aim be dead center for a good solid hit to happen. So playing consistently is something that will go really far in helping somebody like myself or Benny decide to use the file sent to us. And then the other one is, again, very obvious when you think about it, but hugely overlooked, is just choosing the right drum so that we're actually receiving the proper sound for the song. So that means if you're meant to have this big, huge rock track and you send me this like really high funk snare, my hands are kind of tied. I won't want to mix that high funk snare because it's just not going to like suit the song. I mean, maybe it will, but chances are it should have been this big, fat, low tune snare, or something like that. There's certain drums that will sound and suit the song you're working on. And if you don't get that right, sampling is the easiest way to change the direction of that.
Absolutely. That's like little side note here. The too high pitched snares is a very common one because people like to have that tight batter hat, that rebound. They like to feel that, like it makes playing a little easier, and like they're just used to that, and it also kills some of the resonances oftentimes and makes the snare a little deader. So people like cranking their snare drum batter hats, but that can lead to these high-pitched, rather thin-sounding snares that don't really fit a lot of rock songs. Yeah, so absolutely right. Good example here.
Yeah, if the podcast can accomplish one thing, and that is more low snares, this is a huge success.
Yeah, it's already worth it for that alone. Yeah. Right. Absolutely.
The world will be a better place.
Yeah, and you can crank, like, to get a little bit of that feel back. By the way, you can crank, or you should actually crank, like the resonant head of the snare, because that will improve how the snares react. It will make it more snappy. It can get you a little bit of that feel back, but it will prevent. And then you can go even lower with the batter head. So I find that this combination of a really cranked resonant head but a lower tuned batter head works really well. Just totally. Side note here.
And one more, I think probably like the best piece of advice we could even give on this episode is the idea of making your own samples when you record your tracks, which is something like, I'm trying to think if anybody's ever sent me samples. Like I get samples in my own sessions. I do it every time, but I don't think anybody that sends me a mix has ever sent me their samples, which they should have captured while they recorded. Benny, chime in here. Have you been receiving samples for mixes? Are the German clients smarter than the Canadian ones?
Yes, I did actually. Yes, I did. Not only from German clients actually, but yes, I really did. Some of them did it because I told them to, but some did it actually just because they did it. But the majority still doesn't. But I just recently included that in my, like, I have a file export and transfer checklist and kind of an onboarding form thing for new mixing clients. And I included it there, and I like ask clients now to, if they can, to record their own samples, because I love to have samples from the actual session, because that's, I mean, it sounds obvious, but that's the most natural thing you can do, you can use, because it will blend really well with the actual recording of the drums usually. I mean, it only works if the choice of drums, like Malcolm said, is right, and if the drums are tuned well and stuff. That's like, that has to be the case, of course. But if that is the case, it will allow me to, or us, to be more flexible, to use more drastic things in the mix, and also to use less drastic like moves to improve things or to make a performance more consistent. And yeah, so if you can, record your own samples, and like, I assume, Malcolm, when you said that, you meant not just like one shots, but maybe just record, I don't know, every the way I do it is every drum, like hit it like 10 times, soft and hard, and like with different like left and right hand and stuff like that, and just send me 10-15 hits of every single shell, and maybe even the cymbals, and I can use them to fix a weird hit. I can use them to add consistency, stuff like that.
Totally, yeah. So if anybody's not sure like how you go about this, I would actually recommend doing it at the start of the session. Maybe you can do it at the start and the end if you really want it, but generally tuning is dialed in a little better at the beginning of the session, and you just get the drummer to give solid hits, like 5 to 10 hits, maybe, and grab some different velocities as well, so like hard, medium, soft, of each drum. So I always get my drummers to like put their hands on the toms so they're muted, and then they'll hit the kick, turn off the snare wires so they're not buzzing away, and just grab some clean hits of each drum kind of thing, and then you can just splice, like cut them up, and you've got some backup samples which can be used in mixing, and they're going to perfectly match the sound of what you recorded. So rather than a mixer like Benny throwing in this totally different snare sample, like of a metal drum, if there was a wooden snare actually recorded, he can use your wooden snare to augment and support your wooden snare, and it's going to like match perfectly. It's going to be way more natural sounding if that's the goal. Like he said, if it's the wrong snare, you might be better off just using a different sample anyways. But even if the recordings aren't very like great, still having those samples is going to be better than trying to like process the heck out of the source one, because there will be no bleed. So the mixer would have more control over like really messing with the sample than they would over the live track, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, totally makes sense. Actually, a very good idea with like muting the toms. I don't think I ever did that. I just have them hit the kick, and like not worry about the tom bleed. But
I mean, there's two minds of that, because like the bleed is going to be kind of natural, like it would probably exist like in the live performance kind of thing. But I like the clean thing. And then if I ever want to use those samples in another situation, I have them more clean, which is nice as well.
Yeah, and absolutely. And if you want to really, if you want to go one step further, let me phrase it like this: you could not only capture the kick mic or the snare mics, you could and maybe should, if you can, capture the overheads, rooms, and everything else as well, and send like whole multi-track of the samples, because then. That will be the most natural thing, because then you can replace the whole picture basically, and not just one mic or one single thing. So if you want to do that, that's actually the best way to go about it. You like at least overheads, rooms, and the close mic, I guess.
Yeah, I would totally recommend doing that. Record the whole, like just keep all the mics live, grab it all, and label clearly as well so you can make sense of what you got. Grab the cymbals, grab the bell ride, grab the hi-hats in different positions, get some flams. I go pretty heavy on it, and it saved my butt a few times.
Yes.
So totally recommend that. If you want to go one step even further, got this off Benny and I's mutual friend, Diego. Shout out to Diego, he's a boss. He actually will remove the other drums. He does this at the end of the session. It's worth stating. So the drums are all tracked, and then he's going to grab samples. So he'll get all the drums pulled off, leave the mics where they are, pull all the drums off, and center whatever drum he wants to sample in the middle of the overhead picture. So there's no weird panning stuff going on. So if he was doing a floor tom, he would pull that to the center of the kit image. Go back a couple episodes if you want to learn about kit imaging. And that way all his samples, if they're stereo and blended with his overheads and rooms, are going to come up the middle and not be panned like the kit is, which is a downside if you're using it in the same song. But if you're using it, trying to make samples for future use and stuff, having them come up right up the middle is going to be a big bonus.
That's interesting.
And then by removing all the other drums, you don't have to worry about any resonances.
Sure, like the resonances, absolutely. But that's kind of interesting. I never heard that. But you have to help me here a little bit, because what I don't get is if you do that, usually also with like other songs, if you use it in a sample library or whatever, don't you want to have like also like a stereo image in the overhead samples?
Well,
like, don't you? I always like it if the toms are like if there's an image.
Totally, but do you use Slate Trigger, for example, to trigger your audio? What do you use as a trigger?
It depends.
Okay.
If I do my own, like if I have my own wave files, or if clients send me their samples, I use Trigger to fire them off.
Right.
Yeah.
So when you load a trigger into Slate, it automatically tells you that it's going up the middle. But if you've recorded it and your floor tom's actually far right in your stereo file, but the drummer happens to have set up with the tom on the far left, you're going to have a problem. So you're removing the guesswork out of it, and everything's coming up center, and then you pan it where you need.
But you mean if you do a combined sample of the close mic, overhead, room, and everything,
yes,
right?
Yes.
Okay, because I don't do that. I have them on separate channels. Like I trigger one close mic, I trigger an overhead sample, and I trigger a room sample. And in the room samples and overhead samples, I want the panning to be correct. And if it's not, I just flip it. And so I treat them as like individual mics of a kit, and I never trigger like a close mic with overheads and rooms in one sample.
Okay. Right.
That's, I think, why I don't. But I get the idea now that you say. Now it makes perfect sense, because you're screwed if it's the other way around then. Yeah.
Totally. And even if it's too wide, like if you make like a room sample of a floor tom and it's obviously panned pretty far, that might not work well on another song if the song was different, panned differently, or like imaged differently in the recording setup.
Okay.
Makes it a little quicker to figure out, I think. But
okay.
It's definitely not a rule.
Yeah. Okay, so now if we I think we probably lost them now.
We've got deep. We could honestly delete that whole part. They don't need that.
No, I don't think so. Let's leave that in. But yeah, maybe. I don't know. I'll decide later. But
okay.
What I think we should maybe now add real quick is there might be people listening now who don't know what this whole like sample enhancement and stuff actually means. So maybe we should explain really quickly what we do here actually. And this is kind of easy to explain. Basically, when there is a drum recording, we have all the multi-tracks. We have like a separate track for each of the shells, for each of the drums, and then the overheads and rooms and stuff. And you can have a plugin look at one of those tracks, for example, the snare track, and that plugin analyzes the snare track and detects all the actual snare hits, and then creates a MIDI note where those snare hits are, or trigger a sample directly. So basically, it's the same with as what we were talking about with the drum programming. It creates a MIDI note, and that MIDI note triggers a sampler, and that sampler fires a snare sample, a pre-recorded sample, and it does it in real time, and it does it like at the same time as the actual snare hit comes in. So you can blend a pre-recorded sample with the actual hits of the snare drum, and the plugin or whatever you use to do that detects those hits and blends it like with the actual performance. Just so you know what we're actually talking about. So we're not taking the sample and then placing it in the song by hand and spending like 3 hours to do that.
No.
You can do that, but it's an automatic process that's pretty easy, and so it's absolutely worth giving us or people or your mixer, whoever you're working with, those samples. Because it's an easy thing to do. It's a common thing to do. Most mixers do it anyways nowadays. And it's not something super complicated that you only do in certain cases. It's just a completely like standard procedure that you do in most mixes, actually. And there are rare cases where you might need to fix a single hit or something. Then you just cut the hit out and then put the sample in or something like that. That can happen. But usually you just have some software detect the performance and then add samples in to taste, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
yeah,
cool.
I would love to see people start making their own samples. There's so many reasons to, like we said, it helps the mixer out a lot in the end process. I've also had it help me out a lot in the production process. So we recorded samples and we decide that we don't like the pattern we have on the drums and we want to change it. So by using those samples, you can actually like full on change your performance if you need to, and have like a different cymbal get hit at a part, or add a cymbal to the song at another part, or like really depending on how much time you want to put into it, you can pretty well fix any situation. And that's pretty powerful because ideas do change, and the flow of the production can change as you go. So having the power to actually alter what has already been done is really useful.
So much, yeah, true, absolutely. Flexibility again, and that's. I think we're going to talk about stuff like that too a lot of times because in this podcast, because I think with DIY recordings, it's rarely a completely like ideal situation. That's just the nature of it, and flexibility is just such a big part of it because it's just very likely, or more likely than in the studio, that some mistake or some not ideal situation or thing comes up, and the more flexibility you give your mixing engineer, the better the result will be and the less risk you take. So especially with the DIY recording situation, this flexibility is king. Like, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. One more argument for getting samples is tuning consistency. And if you dial in and a reason I like to do it at the beginning is because normally when I'm like signed off on the drum sound and we're about to start tracking, I'm like, okay, things sound awesome right now. And that generally means that the tuning is also in place. So if you grab samples at that moment, you've got like this well-tuned kit that's going to be locked in. So if the tuning slips through the song, you have like this reference that you can actually look at. You can go and listen to that snare sample you recorded earlier and be like, okay, our snare has slipped quite a bit lower, and tune it back to that hit you've got as like a reference. And you can keep your drum sound on track by using your pre-recorded samples as you're like, okay, I know it's meant to sound this good and it doesn't right now. So let's get it back to that.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Tuning reference, such a big thing. I do that all the time, actually. I like whenever a session goes longer than just a couple of hours, or like if you have a drum recording session over a couple of days, it's inevitable that like things will change, even if you don't touch it. And you kind of sometimes you get used to those changes because they are like happening slowly, and you don't even notice when like the snare usually drops, like the pitch usually drops, and like you start with the perfect snare, and then after a couple of hours the snare is lower than it was in the beginning, and you might not necessarily notice that, and then maybe you find that you want to redo a part of the first part that you recorded that day or whatever, because now you're warm, now the drummer is like in the zone, and the performances get better, so you might decide to go back to the first song again, or you just want to have consistent tuning throughout a song or throughout multiple songs. but then it's just not the same anymore. And when you go back to the first song, then it doesn't match. So if you have those samples, you can, before every take or before every part or every song or whatever, you can quickly compare the current like pitch of the snare or toms to the sample and make sure that it stays consistent. And you also notice when drum heads die that way, because with sessions over a couple of days, drum heads might die, and they probably will die, and it might be a good idea to change them. And you will notice that as well, because even if you can recreate the pitch, they might have like less attack or a weird kind of sustain, or they just might they might start to sound like muffled or whatever. And if that happens, if the heads just die, then you'll notice and you can change them. So this reference is a really, really great thing to have.
Totally. It's not uncommon in like a upper budget, high end recording session to have the drum tech going in and checking the snare tuning every take. Literally every pass. Go in, he throws in the cans, listens to it, plays it, compares it, adjusts it, and then the drummer comes back and plays it. Sometimes the drummer is also the drum tech, but this is a real thing. It's not being too picky.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, nothing to add to that. Totally right. What else do you have on your list, Malcolm, things to add to this topic?
I think we're doing pretty good. I'm not sure if I have other stuff. I had one, this is kind of a mixing thing. If you don't have drum samples, you can do a lot to make your drum samples that you're adding in sound more natural by using the tune function in your sampler. So like say Trigger has a tune function, and I'll always experiment with that and try and get my chosen samples to be closer to the original snare, especially what the snare sounds like in the overheads or the rooms, and kind of like lower it or tune it higher to suit the actual live drum recording, and I have great results with that.
Absolutely, and that could be useful if you don't mix yourself, because maybe you do this samples later in the session, or you did them at the beginning, but then you record another song with like a slightly different snare tuning, and you forgot to do new samples then, which you always should. Like if you change the tuning of the drums throughout the record, which can happen, then make sure you record new samples for that song. But if you forgot to do that, or if for some reason something changed, you can like just copy the samples, the original samples, and then tweak the copy of it to match the song that you want to use them for, like tune them higher or lower after the fact. And if you don't have Trigger to do that, there's a cool plugin by Waves. It's not that expensive. It's called Torque. That I use that all the time. It works really well. It's basically designed just for that, just to mix and match samples and retune drums after they've been recorded. So you can try that and see if that works. Yeah.
Cool. I haven't tried that. I'll check it out.
You should. It's super, super good. Like it not only it's not only simple pitch shifting. It does. I don't know what it actually does, but it sounds so natural and cool, and has saved a lot of sessions for me.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll totally check it out.
And then I think one last thing here before we wrap it up is what you can also do is like adjust the way you set up your drums.
Right.
And get used to that before we forget, because the performance is one thing, and that's super important. Like hit the shells hard, control the cymbals. We've talked about that before, and we will again probably, because it's so important. But other than that, just the physical setup is also helping here a lot if you want to preserve more of your natural drums. So keeping the cymbals away from the close mics, that you have the least amount of bleed in your close mics. So that, and you can get used to that pretty quickly. Like people are often afraid of that because it's not as comfortable to play if you're not used to that, but you can get used to that really quickly. And a nice side effect of that is if you, for example, put your hi-hats up higher so that they are away from the snare, that usually also leads to playing them more quiet, because if they're like way down, you just naturally hit harder because you push down towards the hi-hats. If they are higher up, you have to lift your arm a bit. You just play softer and more controlled, and you have also more room to like lift your left arm and hit the snare hard. So it also will probably improve the way you play a bit. So I would definitely try that and get used to that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And don't underestimate what a small change will do. Like a couple inches of the hi-hat being moved away from the snare makes a huge difference in the bleed. It doesn't have to, you don't have to place it on the other side of the room and have your drummer like reaching with a big pole to hit it. Small changes go a long way.
Sure. Absolutely. Okay. So I guess the main takeaway from this episode is that you don't need to be afraid of drum samples. And if a mixer tells you, or if you feel like a mixer uses samples, or if he or she tells you that they use samples, or if somebody asks you to deliver samples for mixing, that's not a negative, not a bad thing, and it will not make your drums sound unnatural if done right. And it can actually save your recordings and make it sound more natural. So that's the main takeaway here that we wanted to get across here. And it's just a very normal process that just happens in modern mixing. And most of your favorite records probably have samples in them. We've talked about that already. And it's not automatically sounding artificial. The opposite is actually the case. And I really had mixes when I back when I wasn't like when I started out and my mixes weren't really sounding great. I sometimes just not used samples because I wanted to kind of challenge myself and learn and wanted to use the real drums. And sometimes bands didn't want me to use samples, and I agreed and just tried it without. And when I listened to those mixes, they sound pretty fake actually, or pretty weird, because I had to do so much EQing and compression and so many weird things came up then in those recordings. And if I had used samples, those mixes would sound much more natural actually. And yeah, and that's what we want to tell you with this, I guess, right?
Totally. I think this is really going to be the standard practice before long. And for some reason, it's taken a lot of time for people to get on board with. But every mixer is taking advantage of these tools and has been since the days of tape. It's not a new thing at all. It's just more known about now. So get on board, record your own samples, and you'll have a better result because of it.
Absolutely. Sure. All right. Then I think that's it. Let's wrap it up. Malcolm actually has a gift for you. If you are mixing your own songs maybe, or if you want to experiment with samples, if you want to listen to what like recorded samples could sound like, how that, like if you want to play around with that, Malcolm, what do you have for our audience?
I'm glad you said that because I had totally forgotten about this. So that's good. So head to stonemastering.com/samples. So stonemastering.com/samples. And yeah, I'll have a couple different like one-shot samples up there for you to download for free, at least for now. And you can use them for whatever you want. You can use them to lay them in your song. I actually use samples all the time in the songwriting process. I just kind of drag and drop patterns around to get me started. Usually a kick and a snare is like all I need. I don't even program in hats or anything, just like a kind of a groove for me to riff to. I use them to augment stuff. You know, if I want like a big bassy, I'll throw in a kick sample and just throw a reverb plug on it, and there's my effect kind of thing. So special effects, stuff like that. You can use them for whatever you want. They're yours once you have them. So head to that if you want to grab those. And you can also use them as like a point of reference when you're making your own samples while you're recording. Something to compare to, you know, that's kind of nice, I think.
Oh yeah, that's absolutely nice. I haven't heard them, but I assume they sound great since you did them.
I hope so anyways. I mean, they're not like super over processed or anything. But I think they're worth throwing up for sure.
All right. Super cool. You should absolutely check out Malcolm's website anyway, because he's a mastering specialist and he is going to help you with taking like your mixes to the next level, and he's kind of the final like quality control after mixing before the songs get released or published or manufactured on CDs or whatever. So if you want to learn about that whole process, I think Malcolm makes it pretty easy for you to contact him and ask him questions and submit your mixes. And just hit him up, have a chat about your music. I'm sure he will be happy to do that. And check out stonemastering.com. And that's also a great way to end this episode, because the next episode will be about mastering. We're gonna talk about what mastering actually is, and we're gonna answer the question that is, do I need to have my music mastered? And I'm sure that Malcolm will answer that.
How do you think I'm going to answer that? Yes.
Sorry?
Yes. The answer is yes.
Yes.
But we're going to explain it. It's going to be a great episode. I'm super excited for that. We're going to really break it down into what actually happens through mastering, so you can understand it better and understand what you're actually accomplishing by hiring a mastering engineer, or even mastering stuff yourself.
All right. I'm excited for that, because mastering is always kind of a dark art, and it's still too many, and many DIY recordings don't get mastered because people think they don't need that, and we're going to talk about that. So, Malcolm, anything to add to this?
No, well, tune in next week, subscribe, leave a review, and we'll see you and talk about mastering in just a week.
All right. Thank you for listening. Bye.
Bye.